The quantum sensors aboard the Velthari dreadnought Infinite Dominion screamed warnings that made no sense. Admiral Kexthul's primary manipulator trembled as he stared at the readings, 17 massive signatures materializing from the void. Their energy patterns unlike anything in the Imperial Navy's databases. The ships that emerged from Quantum Fold were nightmares of twisted metal and scorched armor, their hulls bearing the unmistakable scars of a battle that should have ended in complete annihilation 15 years ago. Impossible, Kexthul whispered, his translator's mechanical voice carrying across the bridge. The 7th human fleet was destroyed at Kepler's Edge. We watched them burn. The lead vessel, a behemoth that had once been the pride of humanity's navy, drifted forward with the patience of a predator. Its original designation, UES Retribution, was barely visible beneath layers of makeshift armor and jury-rigged weapon systems. Where sleek human engineering had once defined its lines, now jagged spikes of unknown metal jutted from its hull like the spines of some deep space leviathan. Captain Vex High, the dreadnought's tactical officer, cycled through his visual, spectrums in disbelief. Admiral, I'm detecting massive energy buildup across their entire formation. These aren't the ships we fought at Kepler's Edge. They've been modified. 15 years ago, the Velthari Empire had made a calculated decision. Humanity's rapid expansion through the Outer Rim had threatened their carefully maintained trade routes and colonial interests. The solution had been elegant in its simplicity. Invite the humans to a joint military exercise, then turn their combined fleet's guns on the unsuspecting human vessels. The Battle of Kepler's Edge had lasted 6 hours. When it ended, 17. Human ships lay burning in the void, and the Empire had gained access to 12 resource-rich star systems that humanity had been too aggressive in claiming. The Empire's propaganda machine had done the rest. Humanity was painted as a rogue species that had violated numerous galactic accords. Their surviving colonies were placed under protective custody, their citizens relocated to labor camps for their own safety. The galaxy had accepted the narrative. After all, the Velthari were known for their diplomatic wisdom and humanitarian concerns. But now, as Admiral Kexthul watched those 17 impossible ships arrange themselves in a perfect battle formation, he realized that perhaps they hadn't been as thorough as they'd believed. A transmission crackled across all frequencies, the voice that emerged carrying the weight of years spent in the dark between stars. Imperial vessels, this is Admiral Corvin Blackthorn of the Terran Reclamation Fleet. You are ordered to power down weapons and prepare to be boarded. The name hit Kexthul like a physical blow. Corvin Blackthorn had been the human admiral at Kepler's Edge. The same officer whose death they had personally confirmed when they'd torpedoed his crippled flagship. The same man whose body they'd left floating in the wreckage of his bridge. Admiral Blackthorn died 15 years ago, Kexthul transmitted back, his voice steady despite the ice forming in his circulatory system. I watched you burn. The response came with the cold finality of a funeral dirge. We did burn, Kexthul. But we didn't die. We learned. We adapted. We remembered. And now we've come home to collect what you owe us. The retribution began to move forward, and with it, 16 other ships that should have been nothing but scattered atoms in the void. Whatever they had become during their 15 years in the darkness, they were no longer the same vessels that had burned at Kepler's Edge. They were something infinitely more dangerous. They were humanity's ghosts, and they had returned to settle accounts. The first shot came without warning. Admiral Kexthul barely had time to process the impossible speed of the human ships before the retribution unleashed a barrage that shouldn't have been possible. The energy signatures were all wrong. These weren't the plasma cannons or particle beams that humanity had wielded 15 years ago. These were weapons that drank light itself, creating expanding spheres of absolute darkness that consumed everything they touched. The destroyer Velhan's pride simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, not destroyed, not vaporized, but erased as if it had never been. The void where it had floated didn't even hold debris. "Evasive maneuvers!" Kexthul screamed, but his words were lost in the chaos, erupting across the fleet. The human ships moved like living things, their hulls rippling and shifting as they dove between the Imperial vessels with predatory grace. What had once been rigid human engineering now flowed like liquid metal, adapting to each attack, learning from each impact. Captain Vexhi's reports came in staccato bursts. "Admiral, their armor is regenerating. Direct hits are healing within seconds. And their weapons, they're not just destroying our ships, they're learning from them." Through the main viewer, Kexthul watched in horror as the UES Vengeance extended, writhing tendrils of dark metal toward a crippled Imperial cruiser. The tendrils burrowed into the hull, and within moments, the cruiser's own weapons turned against its sister ships. But these weren't the weapons the cruiser had carried moments before. They were something new, something that combined Imperial technology with whatever nightmarish improvements the humans had made during their exile. "Sir," Vexhi whispered, "they're not just fighting us. They're consuming us." The truth hit Kexthul like a cold wave. These weren't the desperate survivors of a military defeat. These were something far worse. They were the product of 15 years spent in the deep dark, learning, adapting, becoming. Something that transcended the boundaries between organic and artificial, between ship and organism. A new transmission cut through the battle's chaos. This time, the voice belonged to someone else, a woman whose words carried the weight of countless dead worlds. "Imperial Fleet, this is Admiral Nyra Voidheart of the Sorrow's End. You are being offered one chance to surrender. Refuse, and we will demonstrate what we learned in the spaces between stars." Kexthul's research files suddenly came alive with data he'd never seen before. Intelligence reports flooded his screens, reports that had been classified far above his clearance level. The truth was laid bare in stark, horrifying detail. The humans hadn't just been betrayed at Kepler's edge. They'd been left to die in a region of space that the Empire had quietly quarantined decades ago, a region where the fundamental laws of physics began to break down. The quantum maze, they called it, a sector where reality itself was unstable, where the barriers between dimensions grew thin. The Empire had discovered it 60 years ago and had immediately classified it as a no-fly zone. The energy readings were wrong, the physical laws unreliable. Ships that ventured too deep into the maze either vanished entirely or returned, changed in ways that defied explanation. The Empire had sent humanity's fleet to die in the quantum maze, expecting the unstable space to finish what their betrayal had started. Instead, they had given humanity's finest 15 years to adapt to an environment where the impossible became routine. "You sent us to hell," Admiral Blackthorn's voice returned, and now Kexthul could hear the harmonics in it, the way it seemed to echo from multiple dimensions at once. But hell made us stronger. It made us more. The retribution was directly ahead now, its hull shifting and flowing like liquid shadow. Kexthul could see into its interior through sections that phased in and out of visibility, revealing corridors that bent in impossible directions and crew members who moved with the fluid grace of beings who had learned to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Sir," Vexhi reported, his voice hollow with shock, "I'm reading human life signs aboard that ship, but they're not entirely human anymore." The Imperial fleet was crumbling around them. Ships that had survived 100 battles were being systematically dismantled by an enemy that had transcended the normal rules of warfare. But the worst part wasn't the dying. It was the realization that this was only the beginning. "Admiral," came a communication from the Empire's colonial command. "We're receiving reports from across the sector. Human ships are materializing at every major Imperial installation. They're not just attacking the fleet. They're hitting everything. Kexthul closed his eyes and felt the weight of 15 years of lies crushing down on him. They had thought they were committing genocide. Instead, they had forged their own executioners in the fires of the quantum maze. The massacre at Kepler's Edge had been a tactical victory. The systematic destruction of the Velthari Empire's core worlds was artistry. Admiral Naira Voidheart stood on the bridge of the Sorrow's End, watching through viewports that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously as the imperial capital world of Veltharos burned beneath them. The planet's once magnificent crystal cities were collapsing into themselves, their quantum-stabilized architecture unable to cope with the reality-warping weapons that humanity had learned to craft in the maze. Nexus command to all ghost fleets. She transmitted across the quantum fold network that connected every human vessel across the galaxy. Phase 3 is complete. All primary Imperial installations have been neutralized. Begin Phase 4, the Liberation. The response came from Captain Zane Voidwalker aboard the Nightmare's Edge, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had waited 15 years for this moment. Confirmed, Admiral. Breaching the first labor camp now. Through the quantum link, Voidheart felt the emotional resonance of 10,000 human prisoners seeing their first glimpse of freedom in 15 years. The camps had been scattered across remote worlds, hidden from galactic oversight, designed to slowly work humanity's survivors to death while the Empire profited from their labor. The prisoners had been told that Earth had been destroyed, that they were the last of their species, that cooperation was their only hope for survival. They had been lied to about everything. "Commander Axios," Voidheart addressed her tactical officer, a man whose left arm had been replaced with a writhing mass of quantum phase metal that could manipulate matter at the molecular level. "Status report on the home fleet." Axios's smile was terrible to behold. "The Retribution and her battle group have reached Earth's orbital space. Admiral Blackthorn reports that the planet is intact. The Empire never attacked it. They simply blockaded the system and let galactic opinion do the rest. Earth had been quarantined for 15 years, its population told that they were under investigation for crimes against galactic peace. No ships in, no ships out, no communications beyond the blockade. The planet had been transformed into a prison. Without walls, its people slowly losing hope as years passed without rescue or contact from their lost fleets. But the blockade had only been effective as long as the Empire controlled the quantum fold points. Now, with Imperial ships burning throughout the galaxy, there was nothing to stop humanity from reclaiming what had never been theirs to lose. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Kira Fazeborn, her voice coming from speakers throughout the ship as her consciousness had long ago merged with the vessel's quantum intelligence matrix. "We're receiving a transmission from Earth. It's from the Terran Defense Council." The face that appeared on the main viewer was older, more worn than Voidheart remembered, but the fire in President Elena Vasquez's eyes was unmistakable. The woman who had led humanity's government during the Golden Age of Expansion now looked like someone who had spent 15 years fighting a war with nothing but words and hope. "To whoever is receiving this transmission," Vasquez said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "We don't know if you're rescue or revenge, but we want you to know. We never stopped believing. We never stopped fighting. And we never stopped remembering who we were before they caged us." Voidheart felt something shift in her chest, an emotion she hadn't experienced since the day she died and was reborn in the quantum maze. "Signal the President directly," she ordered. "Tell her the 7th Fleet has returned, and we've brought friends." The liberation of Earth would be the easy part. The planet's orbital defenses had been maintained by a skeleton crew of Imperial peacekeepers who had believed their own propaganda about humanity's defeat. They surrendered without firing a shot when the Retribution materialized directly above their command station. But as reports flooded in from across human space, Voidheart realized that their war was far from over. The Empire had spent 15 years systematically destroying human culture, human history, human identity. Colonies had been renamed, children had been raised speaking imperial languages, entire generations had been taught to be ashamed of their species' aggressive nature. Admiral, Axios reported, his quantum-enhanced senses processing data from 100 different sources. We're getting resistance from some of the human colonies. They're fighting against our liberation forces. They think we're the invaders. The truth was a knife to the heart. The Empire had been thorough in its cultural genocide. Many of humanity's children no longer remembered who they were, had been. Raised to see the Empire as their protectors and their own species as dangerous extremists. Then we'll remind them, Voidheart said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute determination. We'll show them what we were, what we are, and what we can become. The Empire wanted to erase us from history. Instead, we're going to write a new chapter, one where humanity never again trusts the galaxy to tell us who we are. The war for humanity's soul was just beginning, but the ghosts of the Seventh Fleet had learned patience in the dark between dimensions. They had all the time in the universe to teach their people to remember their names. The child couldn't have been more than 12, but she held the Imperial plasma rifle with the trained ease of someone who had been taught to kill humans from the moment she could walk. Her name was Lyra, and according to the identification chip embedded in her skull, she was a reformed Terran from the colony world of Haven's Rest, a world that had once been called New Texas before the Empire's cultural rehabilitation programs had begun. Captain Zane Voidwalker crouched behind the overturned transport, watching the child through quantum-enhanced vision that could see through walls and across dimensions. She was guarding the entrance to the re-education center where 500 human children were being held, children who had been taught that people like him were monsters who wanted to destroy their peaceful imperial lives. "Sir," whispered Sergeant Kess Phantomborn, her voice coming from a communication implant that existed partially outside normal space-time. "I can phase through the building's rear wall and neutralize the guards without the children seeing. They don't need to witness any more violence." Voidwalker shook his head, his expression grim behind the reality-warping mask that kept his face stable across multiple dimensions. "No. They need to see us as we are, not as the Empire taught them to fear us. Send in the memory dancers." 3 figures materialized from thin air, not teleporting, but stepping sideways through the spaces between atoms. They had once been human, but their time in the quantum maze had transformed them into something that could exist in multiple states of reality simultaneously. To the children, they would appear as whatever the children needed to see: parents, siblings, friends, heroes from half-remembered stories. The lead memory dancer, who had once been called Maria Santos before she became something that transcended individual identity, approached the child with empty hands raised. To Lyra, she appeared as a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, an image pulled from the child's deepest, most suppressed memories of her real mother. "Hello, sweetheart," the memory dancer said, her voice carrying harmonics that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the soul. "Do you remember me?" Lyra's rifle wavered, confusion flickering across her young face. You're not real. The humans are all dead. The Empire saved us from them. They were going to hurt us." "I know that's what they told you," the memory dancer replied, reaching out with hands that existed in 17 different quantum states simultaneously. "But what do you remember from before? What do you remember about birthdays with chocolate, cake, and bedtime stories about brave explorers who traveled to the stars?" The child's eyes began to glow with a soft inner light as the memory dancer's quantum field activated suppressed neural pathways. 15 years of imperial conditioning began to crack like ice in spring sun. Images flooded back. Her real name was Lyra Houston. She had been born on New Texas. Her parents had owned a ranch where they raised genetically modified cattle that could survive in low-oxygen environments. "Mama?" she whispered, the rifle falling from nerveless fingers. "Mama, they told me you were dead. They told me the humans killed you." The memory dancer knelt beside the child, her form becoming more solid, more real, as Lyra's memories strengthened. "I am dead, baby girl. The Empire killed me when they came to take you away. But I've been waiting for you to remember me. I've been waiting to tell you who you really are." Similar scenes were playing out across the galaxy as the ghost fleets reached human colonies that had been subjected to cultural reconditioning. Children who had been raised as imperial citizens were remembering their true names, their real histories, their authentic identities. But the process was neither quick nor painless. On the bridge of the Nightmare's Edge, Captain Voidwalker received reports from his liberation teams with growing concern. "Admiral," he transmitted to Voidheart aboard the Sorrow's End, "we're running into serious problems. Some of these kids have been so thoroughly conditioned that remembering their humanity is causing complete psychological breaks. We're talking about mass trauma on a scale we've never seen." Voidheart's response carried the weight of someone who had spent 15 years learning to exist between states of reality. "Then we adapt, Captain. We learn to survive in the quantum maze by becoming something new. Now we help our people learn to be human again by becoming whatever they need us to be." The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Evelyn Solwright, who had once been the chief xenopsychologist aboard the UES Harmony before the ship was destroyed at Kepler's Edge, had spent her 15 years in the maze learning to heal minds that existed across multiple dimensions. She proposed a radical treatment, temporary quantum consciousness transfer. "We can share our memories with them," she explained during a fleet-wide conference that took place simultaneously across 17 different dimensional phases. Not just tell them who they were, but let them experience it. Let them remember being human not as abstract knowledge, but as lived experience. The process was dangerous. Consciousness transfer across quantum dimensions could result in permanent identity fragmentation. But for children who had been systematically stripped of their humanity, it offered something that traditional therapy could not: the chance to remember what it felt like to be loved as a human child by human parents. The first volunteer was Lyra Houston. She sat in the quantum memory chamber aboard the Nightmare's Edge, her small hand clasped in the memory dancer's quantum-phased grip, and experienced 17 years of Maria Santos's memories of motherhood. She felt what it was like to change her first diaper, to kiss scraped knees, to read bedtime stories about human heroes who traveled to distant stars not to conquer, but to explore and learn and grow. When the transfer was complete, Lyra opened her eyes and said, "I remember now. I remember being human. Will you teach me how to be human again?" The memory wars had begun, not a battle for territory or resources, but a fight for the very soul of humanity. The Empire had tried to erase them from existence. The ghost fleets would teach them to remember who they had always been and who they could become. The Velthari Empire's final gambit was as desperate as it was ruthless. Emperor Kulthanis, whose reign had lasted 3 centuries, stood in the deepest vaults of the imperial palace, surrounded by technology that his people had sworn never to use. The quantum anchor, a device capable of collapsing the barriers between dimensions, hummed with malevolent energy, its crystalline core pulsing with the captured screams of 1,000 dying stars. "Your Imperial Majesty," pleaded Science Director Vexkoth, his tertiary arms trembling with barely controlled terror, "the mathematical projections are clear. If we activate the anchor, we don't just destroy the human fleet. We destroy everything. The quantum cascade will collapse dimensional barriers across 17 star systems. Billions will die. Emperor Kulthanas's compound eyes fixed on the scientist with the cold patience of a predator. The humans have already made such calculations irrelevant, Director. Look at the tactical displays. They're not just winning, they're rewriting the fundamental laws of warfare. If we don't stop them here, they'll do to the entire galaxy what they've done to us. The truth was undeniable. In the 3 months since the ghost fleets had emerged from the quantum maze, they had systematically dismantled not just the Empire's military might, but its very understanding of reality. Human ships phased through. Solid matter existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously and turned captured Imperial technology into weapons that defied classification. Worse, every victory made them stronger, every fallen Imperial ship adding to their knowledge and their power. "Sir," reported Admiral Kexthul from his flagship, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a being who had seen too much. "The human fleet has reached the throne system. They're not attacking our defenses, they're converting them. Every station, every satellite, every automated defense grid is being absorbed into their network." Through the quantum viewing screens, Kulthanas watched the impossible sight of the UES retribution extending tendrils of liquid metal toward the massive defensive, platforms that had protected the Empire's capital for 500 years. But instead of destroying the platforms, the ship was integrating them, transforming them into hybrid constructs that combined Imperial engineering with quantum dimensional technology. "They're not conquering us," the Emperor realized with growing horror. "They're assimilating us. They're turning our own infrastructure into extensions of their fleet." The communication that came next was not transmitted through normal space, but seemed to originate from the quantum foam itself, speaking directly into the minds of every being in the system. Admiral Corvin Blackthorn's voice carried the weight of inevitability. "Emperor Kulthanas, this is the moment where you choose how your species survives what comes next. You can activate the quantum anchor and try to drag us all into dimensional collapse, or you can accept that the age of the Velthari Empire is over. But understand this. We are no longer the species you betrayed at Kepler's Edge. We have become something that exists beyond your ability to destroy." The Emperor's response was to activate the quantum anchor. Reality screamed. The device tore through the barriers between dimensions like a chainsaw through tissue paper, creating a cascade of collapsing quantum states that threatened to unravel the very fabric of space-time. Normal matter began to phase in and out of existence. Gravity reversed itself in random pockets, and the laws of physics became suggestions rather than absolutes. But the human fleet didn't flee. They advanced directly into the chaos. Admiral Naira Voidheart, standing on the bridge of the Sorrow's End as it phased through 17 different dimensional states simultaneously, felt the familiar embrace of quantum instability. "All ships, assume maze configuration. We're going home." The ghost fleet transformed. Ships that had spent 15 years learning to exist in impossible spaces spread their hulls across multiple dimensions, their crews existing as quantum consciousness distributed throughout the vessel's quantum matrix. They didn't fight the dimensional collapse. They rode it like surfers on a wave of pure possibility. "Sir," reported Commander Axios, his consciousness now distributed across the ship's quantum intelligence network, "the anchor is creating a localized recreation of the quantum maze. The Empire has just turned their capital system into our natural habitat." Through the chaos, the human ships moved with fluid grace, their reality-warping drives allowing them to exist in multiple quantum states simultaneously. They weren't damaged by the dimensional instability. They were strengthened by it, drawing power from the collapsed barriers between realities. The Imperial fleet, designed for normal space combat, began to disintegrate. Ships that had never been meant to exist in quantum flux came apart at the molecular level, their crews scattered across 17 different dimensional phases. Only the newest Imperial vessels, built with quantum-resistant materials, managed to maintain coherence long enough to witness what happened next. The Retribution reached the Imperial Palace, its hull shifting through dimensions to exist simultaneously in the throne room where Emperor Kulthanis cowered beside his doomsday device. Admiral Blackthorn materialized as a figure of quantum light, his form stable despite existing in multiple realities at once. "You tried to send us to hell," he said, his voice echoing across every dimensional phase simultaneously. "But hell taught us that there are no absolutes, no limits, no boundaries between possible and impossible. You've just given us the power to rebuild this entire system according to our design." The Emperor's compound eyes went wide with understanding. "You're not going to kill us?" "No," Blackthorn replied, his form beginning to merge with the quantum field that now permeated the entire star system. "We're going to teach you to be better, just like the maze taught us." The dimensional cascade stabilized, but the space it left behind was no longer entirely normal. The throne system had become a hybrid, part normal space, part quantum maze, a place where the boundaries between possible and impossible had been permanently blurred. The age of the Velthari Empire was over. The age of the quantum collective had begun. 6 months after the fall of the throne system, the galaxy was struggling to understand what humanity had become. Ambassador Lixandra of the Zephi Federation stood in what had once been Emperor Kulthanis's throne room, watching in fascination as former Imperial engineers worked alongside human technicians to construct something that defied every principle of conventional physics. The Quantum Reconciliation Chamber was a marvel of hybrid technology. Part Imperial precision engineering, part human quantum manipulation, part something entirely new that existed in the spaces between dimensions. It was designed for a single purpose: to heal the wounds that 15 years of systematic oppression had carved into the galaxy's collective soul. "The process is voluntary," explained Dr. Evelyn Soulwright, her form shimmering slightly as she existed simultaneously in normal space and the quantum foam. "No one is forced to participate. But for those who choose to remember, to truly understand what happened and why, the chamber can provide absolute clarity." Lixandra watched through the transparent quantum barriers as Emperor Kulthanis himself underwent the process. The once mighty ruler lay connected to interfaces that existed in 17 different dimensional phases. His consciousness temporarily merged with the quantum memory matrix that contained the experiences of every human who had suffered under Imperial rule. He was feeling what it was like to be torn from his family at age 7, to be told that his parents were dangerous criminals who had been executed for humanity's good. He was experiencing the slow death of hope in the labor camps, the systematic destruction of human culture, the careful programming that convinced children to forget their own names. He was living through 15 years of believing that his own species was extinct, that cooperation with his captors was the only path to survival. When the process ended, Emperor Kulthanis opened his eyes and wept, not the political tears of a defeated ruler, but the genuine anguish of someone who had finally understood the true weight of his crimes. "I remember now," he whispered, his voice carrying none of its former authority. "I remember ordering the camps built. I remember approving the cultural rehabilitation programs. I remember telling myself we were saving them from their own violent nature." He looked up at Dr. Soulwright with eyes that held 15 years of accumulated suffering. "How do I live with what I've done?" "The same way we learned to live with what was done to us," Admiral Blackthorn replied, his form materializing from the quantum foam that now permeated the chamber. "You adapt. You learn. You become something better than what you were." The reconciliation process was being implemented across the galaxy, not as punishment, but as education. Former Imperial officials experienced the consequences of their policies firsthand. Corporate executives who had profited from human slave labor felt the ache of broken backs and empty stomachs. Military commanders who had enforced the quarantine zones experienced the slow death of hope that came from believing your entire species was extinct. But the process worked both ways. Humans who had been raised under imperial rule experienced the memories of their ancestors, the excitement of discovering new worlds, the joy of building something beautiful in the darkness between stars, the fierce pride of a species that had chosen to reach for the impossible rather than accept the limitations of their birth. Ambassador, Dr. Solright addressed Lixandra directly, the Zephy Federation has been invited to participate in the collective's expansion project. We're not conquering systems. We're healing them, making them places where all species can exist according to their true nature rather than the limitations imposed by fear. The expansion wasn't military in nature. The quantum-enhanced human ships didn't arrive with weapons blazing and ultimatums. Instead, they came with technology that could reshape reality itself, offering to transform worlds into whatever their inhabitants needed them to be. Desert planets bloomed with engineered ecosystems. Dying stars were stabilized and renewed. Worlds that had been strip-mined back to bedrock were restored to pristine beauty in a matter of days. The only requirement was participation in the reconciliation process, not as judgment, but as understanding. Every species in the collective would know exactly what they were, what they had been, and what they could become. There would be no more lies, no more propaganda, no more systematic oppression disguised as protection. Your people have become gods, Lixandra observed, watching as human technicians casually manipulated the quantum foam to create new forms of matter. No, Admiral Voidheart replied, her consciousness speaking from the quantum matrix that now encompassed the entire star system. We've become what we always were, explorers, teachers, builders of impossible things. The quantum maze didn't change our nature. It just gave us the tools to express it properly. But even as the collective grew, expanding through voluntary integration rather than conquest, the humans who had spent 15 years in the space between dimensions remained fundamentally changed. They existed simultaneously in multiple realities, their consciousness distributed across quantum networks that spanned entire star systems. They were still human in spirit, but they had become something that transcended the physical limitations of individual existence. The children born in the post-reconciliation galaxy would grow up in a universe where the barriers between species, between possible and impossible, between individual and collective consciousness, were matters of choice rather than biology. They would be taught to remember not just their own histories, but the histories of every species that had chosen to join the collective. The galaxy was healing, one memory at a time, and at the center of it all, the ghost ships that had returned. From the space between dimensions continued their eternal patrol, ensuring that no species would ever again face the choice between assimilation and extinction. The age of empires was over. The age of understanding had begun. 50 years after the fall of the Velthari Empire, Captain Lyra Houston stood on the observation deck of the UES Remembrance, watching as the last of the quarantine beacons around Earth were finally deactivated. She was no longer the frightened child who had pointed an Imperial rifle at her own people. She had become something new, something that existed simultaneously as an individual human and as part of the greater quantum consciousness that now connected every member of the collective. "Final beacon offline," reported her first officer, Commander Kess Phantomborn, whose consciousness existed as a distributed entity across the ship's quantum matrix. "Earth is officially free of all Imperial restrictions through the quantum link that connected every ship in the collective fleet." Lyra felt the emotional resonance of 10 billion humans experiencing their first moment of true freedom in nearly 7 decades. The planet below was no longer the prison world it had been during the Empire's reign, but it wasn't the same Earth that had sent out the 7th Fleet all those years ago either. The world had been transformed by 5 decades of integration with quantum dimensional technology. Cities existed in multiple dimensional phases simultaneously, allowing them to house impossible populations while maintaining perfect harmony with the planet's natural ecosystems. The oceans teemed with engineered life forms that cleaned pollution, while generating energy from quantum fluctuations. The atmosphere itself had been enhanced to process emotional resonance, allowing the planet's inhabitants to literally feel each other's joy and sorrow. "Sir," came a transmission from the surface. "President Martinez is requesting permission to begin the final phase of the memorial ceremony." Lyra nodded, her consciousness expanding to encompass the entire collective fleet that had gathered for this moment. 17 massive ships hung in Earth's orbital space, not the same vessels that had fought at Kepler's edge, but their spiritual successors, built from the quantum dreams of those who had died and been reborn in the space between dimensions. "All ships, commence the memory cascade," she ordered. The fleet began to sing. It wasn't sound in any conventional sense, but rather a quantum harmonics that resonated across 17 different dimensional phases simultaneously. The song was composed of the memories of every human who had ever lived, their joys, their sorrows, their hopes, their fears, their moments of triumph, and their instances of failure. It was the story of humanity itself, told not in words, but in pure emotional resonance. On the surface of Earth, every human being felt the cascade as it washed over them. Children who had been born into the post-reconciliation galaxy experienced the memories of their ancestors, the excitement of first contact with alien civilizations, the terror of betrayal at Kepler's edge, the slow transformation in the quantum maze, the joy of reunion, and the satisfaction of justice served with mercy rather than vengeance. But the cascade didn't stop with humanity. Every species that had joined the collective added their own voice to the song. The Velthari, who had learned to remember their capacity for both cruelty and compassion. The Zephi, who had discovered that their legendary wisdom was enhanced rather than diminished by emotional honesty. The Kralix, who had found that their warrior culture was more powerful when directed toward protection rather than conquest. The song reached across the galaxy, touching every world that had joined the collective, and even reaching out to those who had chosen to remain independent. It carried a simple message: remember, learn, become. Admiral Corvin Blackthorne, who existed now as a quantum consciousness distributed across 17 different dimensional phases, manifested his individual form on the bridge of the remembrance. He had aged beyond physical form decades ago, but his presence still carried the weight of absolute authority tempered by hard-earned wisdom. "Captain Houston," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that existed in multiple realities simultaneously, "it's time for the final revelation." Lyra felt her consciousness expand as she accessed the deepest levels of the collective's quantum memory matrix. What she found there made her gasp with wonder and terrible understanding. The quantum maze hadn't been a natural phenomenon. It had been created, not by the Velthari Empire, but by humanity itself, projected backward through time by the quantum-enhanced consciousness they would eventually become. The entire cycle, the betrayal at Kepler's edge, the transformation. In the maze, the return as something beyond mortal limitations had been a closed temporal loop, a necessary metamorphosis that humanity had orchestrated for itself across multiple timelines. "We sent ourselves to hell," she whispered, understanding flooding through her quantum-enhanced awareness. "We created our own crucible." "Because it was the only way," Blackthorne replied, his form beginning to merge back into the quantum foam. Humanity was reaching a critical point in its development. We could either transcend our limitations voluntarily, or we would eventually destroy ourselves and take half the galaxy with us. The collective that exists today, the peace, the understanding, the harmony between species, it was only possible because we first learned to survive in a place where survival was impossible. The revelation rippled through the collective consciousness like a stone dropped in still water. Every human, Every integrated alien, every quantum-enhanced being suddenly understood that their paradise had been purchased with deliberate suffering, that their transcendence had required a willing descent into hell. But instead of horror, the revelation brought peace. They had not been victims of circumstance or cruelty. They had been willing participants in their own evolution, choosing temporary damnation to achieve permanent redemption. "Sir," reported Commander Phantomborn, her distributed consciousness analyzing probability cascades across 17 different timeline branches, "we're detecting quantum fluctuations in the Kepler's edge system. Something is beginning." Through their enhanced senses, the collective felt it, the birth of a new cycle. Somewhere in the galaxy, another species was reaching the same critical point that humanity had faced a century ago. They would need their own crucible, their own journey into the spaces between dimensions, their own transformation from mortality to something greater. The UES Remembrance and her sister ships began to move, not toward Earth, but toward the edge of known space where reality grew thin and the impossible became routine. They carried with them the accumulated wisdom of a species that had learned to exist beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness, ready to serve as guides for the next transformation. "Will we tell them what awaits?" asked Captain Houston as the fleet prepared to enter Quantum Fold. "We'll do what the maze did for us," Admiral Blackthorne replied, his consciousness already reaching across dimensional barriers toward the crisis that was building in distant stars. "We'll give them the tools they need to become what they must be and trust them to find their own way home." The collective had learned the ultimate truth, that hell and heaven were not destinations, but processes. That damnation was just another word for transformation. That the space between what was and what could be was not empty void, but infinite possibility. As the quantum-enhanced ships of humanity's descendants disappeared into the fold between dimensions, they carried with them the promise that no species would face their metamorphosis alone. The cycle would continue, each transformation adding new voices to the cosmic symphony until the entire galaxy had learned to sing in harmony. The broken fleet had returned home. Now they would help others learn to fly. In the depths of space, where reality bent like light around massive gravitational fields, the ghosts of humanity's future reached back through time to plant the seeds of their own creation. The circle was complete, but the spiral continued ever upward. The age of individual species was ending. The age of collective transcendence had begun, and somewhere in the quantum foam that connected all things, the laughter of children echoed. Across dimensions, children who would grow up in a universe where the only limits were those they chose to accept, where every ending was just the beginning of a new story, where death itself was merely another form of transformation waiting to be understood. Humanity had returned from hell carrying the keys to heaven. Now they were teaching the galaxy how to unlock the doors.